If you wanted to start by perhaps setting out the shortcomings with the Domestic Abuse Act and the differences then that ought to have been included in the alternative bill that Imkaan's produced.
Yeah, that's fine. So the Domestic Abuse Bill, which is now the Act, was produced by Imkaan because we know, and we knew at the time that the bill came out in 2018, that Black and minoritized women were not adequately protected by UK legislation, such as the Domestic Abuse Bill at the time. The alternative bill addressed the gaps in the legislation. And actually, the production of the alternative bill was based on CEDAW recommendations, general recommendations number 19, 28, 23, and 35. And also, it was compliant with the Istanbul Convention. So the gaps that we identified with the Domestic Abuse Bill that we used the alternative bill to address were the following. The domestic abuse definition in the Domestic Abuse Act. So it's the Act now, it was the bill then when we produced the alternative bill, did not address all forms of violence against women and girls as consistent with international convention and other agreements to which the UK government is signatory. There was no recognition of violence against women and girls as being gendered. This omission meant that the root causes of violence, patriarchy and inequality were not covered by the definition. In policy terms, we were concerned that the government assumed a gender neutral stance to the problem of violence against women and girls, which we believed to be an ineffective framework in understanding and addressing violence against women and girls. There were other omissions as well. There was no mention of safe reporting for women. There was no mention of women's specialist provision as part of the safe pathways that are regularly accessed by women and girls, including specialist support for Black and minoritized women. Women and girls specialist support agencies were not mentioned in the bill. There was an emphasis on multi-agency working in terms of the government's approach, specifically focusing on statutory services, but not grassroots community women's organizations. This single statutory pathway was introduced in the bill and basically was very different to the rights-based women-centered grassroots organizations, and these organizations were not identified on the single pathway. Implicit in this approach is that local authorities as statutory providers would be holding services and the funding in-house, and this threatened the survival of specialist women's services. There is no commitment in the bill to funding women's organizations. Violence against women and girls cannot be addressed without the specialist women's sector providing support to women under the rights-based approach, which addresses the underlying principles of CEDAW regarding equality and ending discrimination. So concluding observation, paragraph 29C, to address concerns regarding the funding of specialist women's organizations include those addressing the needs of Black and minoritized women and girls. There was also a strong emphasis in the bill on police and the criminal justice system, creating a reporting environment that is about policing violence against women and girls, which could have detrimental impacts on Black and minoritized communities, using reporting requirements under the Act as the policing of communities. The inference here is for a single referral pathway, which means that only statutory pathways for reporting and identifying will provide women and girls and victims of domestic abuse with the support that they need. This practice is already being established in some of the local authority areas that we are very concerned about. There was no mention of specialist and dedicated support providers who are completely absent from the radar. The risk here is that specialist women's providers will be at risk of closure, as there is no emphasis of their inclusion in the economy of provision. Equally, there was no new provision for women with no recourse to public funds. They were actually excluded from the Act, and any other women with insecure immigration status or migrant women. And this reinforced a hostile environment and a state of impunity through non-action. So the language of the bill did not reflect gendered responses or interventions, especially paving the way, and this is where we had significant concern, paving the way for generic, non-gender specific services, and creating a gender neutral framework that disregards the full context of prevention, provision, protection in addressing violence against women and girls in UK society. So the alternative bill that Imkaan produced was framed under CEDAW and addressed the gaps that I've highlighted in the domestic abuse bill. For example, General Recommendation 23, that women from affected communities have a crucial role in the design, the implementation, and the evaluation of programs. And this recommendation is implemented, ensuring that specialist women's organizations participate actively and meaningfully in consultation and through collaboration. But implicit within this is that it shouldn't just be a tick box exercise completed by specialist women's organizations. It is about placing women, especially Black and minoritized women, at the center, ensuring their involvement throughout. General Recommendation 28 calls on the state to address all legal obligations to respect, protect, and fulfill women's rights to non-discrimination and enjoyment of equality. And General Recommendation number 19 includes gender-based violence in the definition of discrimination, and that states that gender-based violence against impairs and nullifies the enjoyment of rights for women. CEDAW recognizes that women experience such violence because they are women, thus recognizing the disproportionate impact and the need for specific measures ensuring equality in all realms of life. The domestic abuse bill at the time did highlight this in the research that was done, but in the actual provisions, it took a very gender neutral approach. CEDAW also considers that all forms of violence against women are fall within the definition of discrimination, and that discrimination is a major cause of such violence, thus linking gender violence to discrimination experienced by women and gender inequality. So the alternative bill called for the protection of specialist women's services through sustainable ring-fence funding, and that the state is responsible for addressing violence against women and girls and ensuring that specialist services, especially for Black and minoritized women and girls and other women subjected to intersecting oppression, were also appropriately supported. And this reinforced women-centered, rights-based, trauma-informed work that these services delivered to address violence against women and girls. The alternative bill, because it is framed to meet CEDAW, provides a legal framework and a comprehensive set of measures to realize women's equality, to end discrimination and racial oppression of Black and minoritized women. And so that's what the alternative bill called for, and it addressed the specific gaps that we felt were necessary at the time in 2018 in the domestic abuse bill. These gaps still exist as the bill has now become an act of Parliament.
On just drawing out more context to a couple of the key points you made there, I wonder if you could elaborate upon the government's gender neutral approach to domestic abuse, but also the impact that has upon the collection and publication of disaggregated data. And I refer specifically to paragraph 14 of your witness statement. I wonder if you could provide those statistics.
Okay, so the question on the gender neutral approach brings together issues regarding data on prevalence, the way that government collects the data, and gender neutrality. So these things are linked. CEDAW recognizes discrimination and inequality experienced by women in all realms of life. So this is covered in Articles 1 and 3, as we know, in the Convention, and in all of the other articles are shaped by these two themes. So for example, Article 2 provides that the state take concrete steps to eliminate discriminatory laws and policies and practices in national legal frameworks. This is, there is full understanding in CEDAW of women's unequal status and the impact that this has on all realms. This implies that the state must monitor the situation of women's inequality and discrimination to ensure that the policies and laws that it adopts are not reproducing inequality, but rather addressing the inequality. This means that we must have clear understanding of the impediments and the barriers regarding women's status, and within this, the situation of Black and minoritized women and other groups of women who are often located on the margins, impacted by intersecting inequalities. So we need this information. We need to know what is happening to women from an intersectional lens, which means we need data disaggregation. The lack of data disaggregation conceals the problem of discrimination and inequality, saying to women that the state does not wish to know the real status of women so that they don't need to respond to it. CEDAW would help to reverse this way of government thinking. So for example, concluding observation paragraph 26A finds that the state must continue to take measures to strengthen the capacity of the government's Equality Office to function as an effective national machinery for the advancement of women. This implies listening to the concerns of women and considering the evidence before them, which can come about through data disaggregation. In terms of declaring whether women's advancement has been met, that must be a conclusion drawn by the women themselves, including Black and minoritized women in the UK. So it is not a conclusion that's drawn by the state, but it is a conclusion that's drawn by the women themselves. Concluding observation paragraph 26D finds that the state must systematically collect and publish data, and that this data must be disaggregated by sex, gender, ethnicity, disability, and age. And that this data then should be used to inform policymaking and assess the impact of the measures taken. This is missing from the government's approach to data collection, as women's voices are often deprioritized and other voices are elevated. So we don't only see this in the way that data is collected, but also in the way that consultations are done regarding specific policies that impact women's lives. So at year-end 2019, the government reported 2.4 million people subjected to domestic violence. The police recorded 1.3 million domestic abuse-related incidents in that year, representing a 24% increase in domestic-related crime reporting from the previous year. The problem with this data is that it is gender neutral. Women are disproportionately impacted by all forms of men's violence, including domestic and sexual violence. However, the government data is not disaggregated to reflect this reality. The questions of data, the question of data is an important one, because there's also concern around data protection and how the government will use the data, which is not always transparent. So the government doesn't always publicize these plans about how it intends to use data. And this specifically affects Black and minoritized women as well as migrant women. But implicit in General Recommendation 9 and the concluding observation, paragraph 25, is that the government must act in such a way regarding data collection that protects women and ensures that the laws and policies do not discriminate women, including by monitoring the performance of government departments regarding women's advancement. Also highlighted in paragraph 25 is that regard must be given to the intersecting forms of discrimination, which I have already talked about in regard to Black and minoritized women and girls. Paragraph 25 also states that areas where women lack substantive inequality, where they lack substantive equality with men, this must be highlighted to inform policymaking to assess whether the measures adopted are having the desired impact. And paragraphs 25 and 26 clearly outline the need for data disaggregation and more systematic data collection around sex, gender, ethnicity, disability, and age. So the impacts, if we don't have data disaggregation, is that, so for example, if we look at government policy, how government policy is developed. For example, if they use the above as evidence, then it does not tell them that women are disproportionately impacted. So if they use the existing data, it's not going to show the disproportionate impact on women. And that means that where we wish for government to have regard for specific measures and resources to addressing violence against women and girls, that may not happen because they haven't got the data to support these actions. It also impacts the type and nature of services provided. Are women-only spaces recognized in commissioning priorities, for example, or are women's organizations who are offering support in women-only spaces, are they a part of commissioning priorities or are they excluded? So the answer to this is that gender neutrality practices where you don't have data disaggregation come into the commissioning priorities so that commissioning priorities, funding decisions are made without the appropriate data and the analysis of that data. There's another, sorry,
please continue.
Yeah, there's another point that I think needs to be made, and that is about the underrepresentation in the data. So data from Frontline Women's Specialist Organization suggested that there were very high rates of violence against women and girls for Black and minoritized women, but only 37% report to police. The reason for low reporting to police includes experiences of racial discrimination, feelings of judgment, and disbelief when Black and minoritized women report to police for support, resulting in secondary victimization. So it is widely documented that 2 women are killed in domestic violence per week in the UK. But for Black and minoritized women, the rates of homicide within this figure is 3 times higher. So the reason for the higher rate of homicide among Black and minoritized women includes barriers to reporting and support, inconsistent responses from statutory services when making presentations, and other structural inequalities. So for migrant women, there is also the lack of a firewall, which becomes a deterrent for reporting. What we are seeing here is the erasure of data on women, and without data disaggregation, as we have seen with the police data. But race erasure also is caused by underreporting because of the lack of trust, discrimination, and the lack of data protection when reporting to the police. We then end up with things like the dual strategy, strategy on domestic violence, which is gender neutral in the context of intimate partner violence, and another strategy which addresses violence against women and girls. This creates significant fragmentation and a piecemeal approach, which we are trying to get away from, because a piecemeal approach doesn't work and it doesn't address the lived experiences of women's lives. So it is important that we look at how the data is used, but also how the data is misrepresented because of the lack of data disaggregation, and how it can lead to the types of policies and measures such as gender neutrality that we are beginning to see in our social policy context.